Have you ever wondered what the world looked like when the silence finally came? When the bells stopped ringing, the carts stopped rolling, and the streets, once echoing with grief, became still again. Tonight, we'll drift back into that silence, to a time just after the Black Death had passed. What remained were empty fields, half-forgotten towns, and the first fragile sounds of life returning. Let yourself relax, settle deeper into the quiet, and if you enjoy these calm journeys through history, let this story carry you gently through the night. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let's begin. The Black Death had swept through Europe like a cold wind through tall grass, invisible, unstoppable, and devastating. But even the darkest storm eventually breaks, and when it did, the world that remained was changed in ways no one could have imagined. The air itself seemed lighter, quieter. The fields lay fallow under a pale sun. Houses stood empty, shutters hanging open to the wind. In the countryside, the sound of birds slowly returned, a small but profound reminder that nature was beginning again. Even as humanity hesitated, dot across villages and cities, survivors stepped cautiously from their homes, as if uncertain whether the danger had truly gone. The roads were still empty, the fields still scattered with signs of loss, but the worst of the silence had passed. Now came the slow rediscovery of life. People looked to the sky, to their neighbors, and to the ground beneath their feet, searching for meaning in a world that no longer looked the same. The soil, left untended for years, grew wild with flowers and weeds. Sheep grazed where farmers once sowed crops. The sound of church bells began to return, not tolling for death, but marking the ordinary hours again. Time itself seemed to restart, gently, uncertainly. In small towns, those who had survived began to rebuild. The scent of wood smoke once more rose from chimneys. Old marketplaces were swept clean. New words appeared in old languages, words for loss, for hope, for renewal. It was as though humanity was learning to speak again after years of silence. And yet, beneath the calm, there was something else, a deep awareness that life would never be quite the same. Entire families were gone. Villages that had stood for centuries had vanished. The survivors carried those absences quietly, like shadows that followed them through the returning daylight. But in that grief, something new began to grow, a subtle, persistent strength. The balance of the world had shifted. For centuries, power had flowed in one direction, from the many to the few, from peasants to nobles, from laborers to lords. But now, with so few left to work the land, that old order began to tremble. A single farmer's hands had suddenly become precious. Fields that once belonged to great estates now depended on the willingness of ordinary people to till them. And in that need, the seeds of quiet revolution were planted. The survivors found themselves, for the first time, with choices. A serf could walk away from his lord's land and find another willing to pay him better wages. A craftsman could open his shop in a new town, his skills more valuable than gold. The emptiness that had once felt like tragedy began to open into opportunity. The world, in its strange, fragile way, was breathing again. In monasteries and abbeys, monks recorded what they saw. Their writing had changed. The chronicles that once recited kings and wars now spoke of ordinary lives, of widows rebuilding, of children returning to school, of the quiet heroism of daily existence. There was a new gentleness in the words, a recognition that history was not only made by those who ruled, but by those who endured. The air smelled different in those years after the plague, cleaner, somehow less crowded. Roads that had once been clogged with trade and travelers were now lined with grass. The rivers ran clearer, the forests grew thicker, the sky seemed wider. Nature had taken back what humanity had once claimed, if only for a little while. And in that breathing space, something shifted inside the human spirit. People began to see the world not just as a place of labor and suffering, but as something living, something sacred. Religion, too, began to change. For centuries, the church had been the center of life, its word unquestioned. But after the plague, many began to wonder, how could so much suffering have happened under divine watch? How could the righteous and the wicked both fall alike? Some turned away, quietly, unsure of their faith. Others turned inward, finding comfort not in the grandeur of cathedrals, but in private prayer and small acts of kindness. Faith became quieter, more personal, less about power, more about peace. Artists began to paint differently. Where once they had filled walls with scenes of judgment and fear, they now painted images of compassion and humanity. saints, not as unreachable beings, but as gentle figures walking among the poor. In the soft light of their art, you can almost feel the tenderness that followed the storm, the need to remember, to heal, to begin again. Trade slowly returned, the empty roads filled once more with carts carrying wool, grain, and spices. In ports along the Mediterranean, ships returned to the sea, their sails rising like pale wings in the dawn. The hum of life, faint at first, began to echo again in market squares, in taverns, in the laughter of children playing in the streets where silence had once reigned. The world had survived, changed, scarred, but alive. And as the years passed, the memory of the plague softened, not forgotten, but absorbed into the rhythm of life. People learned to live with the memory, to carry it without fear. It became a quiet reminder of how fragile and precious life could be. In time, the population began to rise again. Families grew, fields were sown, towns expanded, but the shape of the world had shifted forever. Those who had once been bound by tradition now found new freedom. The old feudal ties loosened. The age of serfdom began to wane. The foundations of modern society, of choice, of labor, of mobility, were quietly laid in the years after the plague. And yet, for all that change, the nights still came as they always had, soft and dark, filled with the same stars that had watched over the living and the lost alike. In those nights, people dreamed again, not of death, but of life, of harvests, of music, of love. The silence had taught them something that would never be forgotten, that life, no matter how fragile, always returns. The fields that had once stood empty would bloom again. The bells that had once tolled for sorrow would ring for weddings and births. The same hands that buried the dead would one day plant seeds. And in that quiet rhythm, loss, renewal, remembrance, the world found its balance once more. The years that followed the silence were unlike any that had come before. Life returned, not as a sudden rush, but as a quiet unfolding, like the slow opening of spring after a long and frozen winter. The people who had survived the Black Death were changed, not just in their hearts, but in the way they saw the world around them. The old patterns of life, the unquestioned hierarchies, the routines that once felt eternal, they all seemed fragile now, like thin glass that had already cracked once and could crack again. In the countryside, where the loss had been most visible, the land began to breathe again. Fields once abandoned grew green once more, but now it was different. Those who worked the land were fewer, and so they were more valuable. The relationship between lord and laborer shifted quietly, almost invisibly, but completely. Men and women who had once bent their backs under obligation now stood taller, aware of their worth. They could negotiate, choose, and sometimes even refuse. It was as though the great leveling of death had left behind a leveling of life as well. The feudal system, the web of duty and power that had held Europe together for centuries, began to loosen. It didn't crumble all at once. It faded softly, over generations, as if time itself were erasing it with a careful hand. The survivors sought something new, though few of them could name it. Freedom was still a fragile word, but it was beginning to take shape in their lives. In towns, the change was different, but just as profound. The plague had taken not only lives, but structure, guilds, councils, and trade networks had collapsed. Now, in the quiet aftermath, they had to be rebuilt, and as they were, they took new forms. Merchant families who had survived became the new architects of society. Their wealth, born not of birthright but of trade, began to rival that of the nobility. Coins replaced oaths, contracts replaced promises. The future was becoming something that could be written, measured, and earned. The air of the cities carried a strange new sound, the hammering of builders, the murmur of traders, the chatter of markets slowly returning. Among the ruins, new workshops opened. Painters, weavers, stonemasons, they all found their hands busy again. But perhaps more than anything, there was a new hunger for beauty. People had lived so long surrounded by death that now they sought to fill the world with color. Church walls, once cold and grey, were painted with frescoes of saints and angels who looked more human than divine. In these faces, you could see compassion, sorrow, and hope, emotions that felt real to those who knelt beneath them. Music returned to soft chants, and early songs drifted through cathedrals once filled only with silence. The echo of voices in those vast spaces sounded like life itself returning, and as faith softened, art deepened. The Black Death had shown how fragile the body was, but it had also made people aware of the soul, not as something distant, but as something lived. Artists began to see holiness, not just in heaven, but in the earth itself, in faces, in hands, in the quiet curve of a farmer's field. Slowly, imperceptibly, this shift in vision gave birth to something new, the beginning of the Renaissance. It started humbly, a painting here, a line of poetry there, but it carried the first breath of a different kind of world, one that valued thought, curiosity, and creation as much as obedience or faith. The scholars of the old monasteries began to look back at forgotten texts from Greece and Rome, opening dusty manuscripts that had lain untouched for centuries. These ancient voices, rediscovered after the silence, began to whisper again about balance, beauty, and reason. The recovery of knowledge was not a rush of excitement, but a slow, contemplative awakening. People began to ask gentle questions. How does the world truly work? What is man's place in it? What does it mean to live a good life? These questions did not bring fear as they once might have. They brought comfort, curiosity, and a sense of purpose. Yet even amid this quiet rebirth, there lingered a shadow of memory. The Black Death was never far from thought. The generation that had survived carried its mark in their hearts. The rhythm of daily life was still shaped by caution. People kept charms against sickness. They whispered prayers at the first sign of fever. There was an unspoken understanding that everything, all joy, all creation was temporary, and that was what made it sacred. In the countryside, communities rebuilt with care. Villages that had once stood close together now spread wider apart, cautious of closeness. The fields were organized differently, often smaller, more personal. Families grew gardens beside their homes, instead of tending the vast communal strips of old. This subtle change, this move toward the private, the individual, would quietly reshape society over centuries to come. The markets, too, changed their tone. They were quieter now, more measured. The laughter had returned, but it was softer, as though people were still listening for echoes of the past. Yet there was also gratitude, an awareness that every loaf of bread, every bolt of cloth, every shared story was something to be cherished. As time passed, the emptiness began to fill. Children were born who had never known the plague. Their parents told them stories of it the way people tell stories of a long winter, something terrible but distant, already softened by retelling. The world these children grew up in was not one of mourning, but one of renewal. They would become the generation that built cathedrals again, that carved statues, that wrote songs. The silence had taught their parents humility, but it had also given them space to imagine something new. Cities began to grow in new ways. The architecture that followed was lighter, more open, more filled with air and light. Windows grew larger, arches more graceful. The world seemed to be lifting its face toward the sky again, no longer bowed by fear. Even the smallest things reflected this shift: the way markets were arranged, the way gardens were planted, the way time itself was measured. Clocks, once rare, became symbols of this new order. People began to think in hours, not seasons, in moments, not just eternities. Time became human again, something that could be touched, divided, and lived. And with that came a sense of forward motion. The world was no longer waiting for the end. It was quietly, steadily, moving toward a future. In homes, families began to decorate their walls with small paintings, not of saints or rulers, but of everyday life. A mother with a child, a shepherd at dawn, a bowl of fruit. These humble images spoke of a changed soul, one that no longer sought only the divine, but found beauty in the ordinary. As the decades passed, the Black Death became both memory and myth. Some said it had been punishment, others saw it as cleansing, others still as mystery. But no one could deny that it had remade the world, not through destruction, but through the space it left behind. In that emptiness, humanity found new room to grow, and though the world would face many more storms, this first great silence after the plague remained a turning point, a soft hinge between ages. Behind it lay the darkness of medieval life. Ahead, the light of discovery, and through it all, the same quiet pulse continued, the rhythm of life returning. Breath by breath, step by step, the fields would yield again, the cities would rise again, the songs would be sung again. The world, once emptied, was slowly, beautifully, filling with sound. As generations passed, the memory of the great sickness faded into whispers and superstition, but its legacy lived quietly in the hearts of people everywhere. It had reshaped the very foundations of life, not through grand revolutions or loud declarations, but through small and steady changes that rippled outward. like circles spreading across still water. In towns and cities, people began to look at the world with a new kind of curiosity. They had seen death close enough to lose their fear of questioning the unknown. The old explanations of spirits, humors, and divine wrath no longer seemed to hold the same weight. The silence the plague had left behind created room for thought, and in that room, questions began to bloom. Physicians, scholars, and monks started to observe more carefully. Instead of accepting what they had been told, they began to test, to watch, to write small notes about the movement of stars, the healing of wounds, the changes in the seasons. These quiet observations were the seeds of a new way of thinking. In monasteries, once heavy with prayer and ritual, candlelight now flickered over open books. Ancient manuscripts from forgotten corners of the world were copied by patient hands. Greek treatises on medicine, Arabic texts on astronomy, Latin records of forgotten histories. The rhythm of copying became the rhythm of revival. Knowledge, once confined to dusty shelves, was beginning to flow again like a spring uncovered after years of frost. Travelers carried this new light with them. Merchants, monks, and wanderers who crossed mountains and seas. They traded not just goods, but ideas. A merchant from Florence might hear of a device in Damascus that measured time more precisely. A student from Paris might read an Arabic commentary on Aristotle. From east to west, knowledge began to move again, quietly, steadily, like wind over tall grass. In the cities, a quiet confidence grew. People began to believe that the world could be understood, that its mysteries were not closed but waiting to be seen. And this belief gave birth to something tender and profound. The early spark of humanism. Humanism did not arrive with trumpets or rebellion. It arrived in whispers, in wonder. It was a shift of the heart more than of doctrine, a belief that the human being, fragile and mortal though he was, could still be noble, capable of reason and creation. It was a philosophy born not of pride, but of healing. After the plague, humanity needed to believe that life itself was sacred again. Writers began to describe not only saints and kings, but ordinary people, merchants, lovers, travelers, dreamers. They found beauty in conversation, in friendship, in laughter shared over bread. The idea that life was not merely a passage to heaven, but a journey worth living in itself, took hold gently, like ivy on old stone. In the workshops of Florence and Venice, artists began to study the body anew, not as a vessel of sin, but as a marvel of nature. They sketched muscles, faces, and hands, fascinated by proportion and movement. The study of anatomy was not only science, it was reverence. Every bone, every curve, every vein was seen as a reflection of creation's harmony. The first portraits appeared, not just of rulers, but of thinkers and patrons, painted with calm faces and distant gazes. Their eyes seemed to say, "We are part of something larger, something beautiful and fleeting." These paintings became quiet celebrations of life after loss, small acts of defiance against the memory of death. In the midst of this soft awakening, cities began to glow again. Florence, Venice, Milan, places that had once echoed with the sound of mourning now filled with the hum of artisans and scholars. Bridges were rebuilt, squares reopened, and churches once silent began to fill with voices. But beneath the beauty, there was still humility, a quiet memory of how fragile it all could be. That memory shaped everything that followed. It gave the new art its depth, its melancholy grace. It made science cautious, measured, and sincere. It made faith gentler, less certain of judgment, more certain of compassion. Even in the smallest corners of life, you could see this change. Farmers rotated their crops with more care, learning through observation rather than superstition. Midwives passed on herbal remedies with quiet confidence. Carpenters designed stronger houses with better ventilation. Every trade, every craft, carried within it a whisper of renewal, a belief that knowledge, once lost, could be found again. The churches, too, transformed. The priests who had lived through the plague were different from those before. They spoke less of wrath and more of mercy. They saw their congregations not as sinners to be corrected, but as souls to be comforted. The bells that had once tolled for the dead now rang for weddings and festivals again, their sound lighter, more hopeful. The Black Death had broken much, but it had also made people see how deeply connected they were, how one life touched another, how every action rippled through the whole. That understanding lingered, quietly shaping communities. When famine came, they shared. When sickness returned, they nursed. Compassion became a quiet kind of wisdom, and in the centuries that followed, this wisdom would bear fruit in countless ways. It would inspire new laws about health and sanitation, new ideas about cities and the common good. It would awaken the desire to measure, to map, to know, not out of greed for control, but out of reverence for understanding. The stars above Europe looked the same as they always had, but now people gazed at them with new eyes. They saw patterns and possibilities. They measured their movement not as omens, but as rhythms, steady, beautiful, mathematical. The heavens no longer seemed a place of divine mystery alone, but of divine order. And as the 15th century unfolded, this order began to reveal itself in art, in architecture, in song. The world was rediscovering its balance. In the quiet evenings, families sat by their hearths, telling stories not of plague and fear, but of recovery and hope. The children who grew up in this new world heard of the Black Death as something that belonged to another age, an age of darkness that had passed. For them, the future seemed open, bright, and endless, and yet, behind the calm glow of candlelight, behind the laughter and rebuilding, the memory of the silence lingered like an old scar, a reminder not of despair, but of survival. It taught people to cherish the present, to find beauty in every small thing. It reminded them that even after the darkest night, dawn will come slowly, softly, but surely. The Black Death had ended, but what it left behind was not emptiness. It was awareness, awareness of life's fragility, of its wonder, of its worth. And from that awareness, civilization would rise again, thoughtful, humble, and luminous. The world was changing, though few noticed it at first. In the soft rhythm of recovery, Europe began to stretch cautiously, like a waking creature after a long sleep. Fields that had lain fallow were once again touched by the plough. Villages that had fallen silent now echoed with laughter and the hammer's ring. Yet, beneath the familiar sounds of daily life, something new stirred, an unseen current of curiosity, of possibility, of quiet ambition. The Black Death had loosened old bindings. So many lives had been lost that the balance between rich and poor, between lord and laborer, between land and hand, began to shift. The survivors found that their work was worth more now, that their voices, once ignored, carried weight. A shepherd might now own the field he once tended. A mason might set his own price. Freedom, small and fragile, began to whisper across the continent. This change did not come as revolt, but as slow transformation. A man who could feed his family without a lord's permission. A woman who could barter her cloth and keep her earnings. These were quiet revolutions. They spread not with fire or sword, but with simple dignity. People began to feel the value of their own effort, and with that came a new sense of self. In small towns, marketplaces grew busier. The air smelled of bread and spices, of wool and leather. Merchants from distant cities returned to their roots, carrying not only goods but the stories of faraway lands. And every story was a window, a glimpse into how vast the world really was. There were tales of the East, of silk and paper, of spices that burned and soothed, of cities built beside great rivers where towers touched the clouds. There were stories of ships with strange sails, of caravans crossing endless deserts. Too many, these tales felt like dreams, but they were enough to awaken imagination. That as trade routes opened again, a new generation of navigators, scholars, and craftsmen began to study the world with clearer eyes. The seas no longer seemed impassable. The horizon, once feared, became a line of promise. Maps began to change, not drawn from myth but from measurement. Coasts were traced with care, mountains marked with accuracy. The earth itself was becoming a place to explore, to understand, to cherish. The printing press, when it came, felt almost like a miracle, though it arrived quietly, in workshops thick with the smell of ink and parchment. For centuries, knowledge had moved at the speed of the scribe's hand. Now, it could spread as fast as paper could be pressed. Words became wings. Ideas that had once flickered in the candlelight of a scholar's study now traveled across cities, across kingdoms, across oceans. A farmer could read of medicine. A merchant could read of astronomy. A child might learn of places they would never see. The printed page carried not only knowledge, but unity, a shared sense of being part of something larger, something enduring. Art, too, continued to bloom. It was as if the painters and sculptors of the new world were trying to make up for all the color that had vanished during the plague. Walls once bare were filled with frescoes of gardens and heavens. Stone once cold became alive with figures, saints and angels, yes, but also peasants, mothers, and children. The human form was no longer hidden, it was celebrated, rendered with tenderness and awe. In Florence, in Venice, in Bruges, a quiet confidence grew. Wealth from trade built, not just mansions, but libraries. The same hands that once built fortresses now built cathedrals that reached upward, not in fear, but in wonder. The Gothic spires that had once seemed solemn now seemed like prayers of gratitude written in stone. But the most profound change was perhaps the one least seen, the change in thought. People began to ask not only what the world was, but why. Why does the sun rise? Why does the tide move? Why does the body heal? These questions, asked softly at first, began to shape an age of inquiry that would one day be called the Renaissance. And yet, it wasn't just about discovery. It was about balance, about rediscovering harmony after chaos. The philosophers of the age looked to the ancient world not as a relic, but as a teacher. They studied the Greeks and Romans, and found in them a mirror, people who had also sought beauty in reason, courage in curiosity, and meaning in the fragile arc of life, in small ways. This rebirth touched everyone. A craftsman might take greater pride in the precision of his work. A mother might teach her children, not just to pray, but to think. A poet might write not of saints, but of love, simple, human, eternal. And through it all, the memory of the Black Death remained like a distant echo. It was not forgotten, but it was transformed. Where once it had been a wound, it now became a warning. A quiet lesson whispered through the generations that life was precious, that time was fragile, that the light must be cherished because darkness can come again. Even as cities grew, as knowledge expanded, there was a humility to the age, an awareness that all this beauty, all this learning, existed only because people had once chosen to rebuild. It made every act of creation, no matter how small, feel sacred. The churches echoed with new music, soft harmonies that lifted rather than lamented. Composers wrote for joy, not for mourning. The human voice, which had once cried out in fear, now sang in praise of life itself. And across the continent, painters began to find light again, not just the light of faith, but of the sun of morning spilling across a hillside, of a candle illuminating a quiet face. They painted shadows not to hide, but to give shape to brightness. The Black Death had ended centuries before, but its shadow continued to shape how people saw the world. It had taught them the value of renewal, and so, with every generation, the world grew brighter, wiser, more compassionate. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, ships began to set sail for places unimagined. The known world widened, and with it came new wonders, new fears, new hopes. But the memory of survival stayed at the heart of it all, a quiet pulse beneath the grand sweep of history. It was the same pulse that had carried the first farmer back to his fields, the first mother to cradle her child after loss, the first artist to lift a brush in the aftermath of silence. That pulse, the enduring rhythm of life, was what truly came after the Black Death. The world did not just recover, it learned how to live again. And so, the world moved gently forward, as if guided by an unseen current that had always been there, patient, steady, unhurried. The Black Death had long passed, but its echo lived in the quiet choices people made, in the rhythm of rebuilding, in the soft pulse of wonder that now defined a new age. The 16th century dawned, not with thunder, but with curiosity. Ships, once built for trade, between nearby ports, now sailed into waters that no map had named. The same hunger for understanding that had risen after the plague now extended to the horizon itself. Mariners stood upon the decks of wooden vessels, feeling the wind in their faces, and the vast unknown stretching before them. The sea had always been a place of mystery, deep, endless, unknowable. To the sailors who set out across it, it must have felt like staring into eternity. But now, the fear that once held them close to the coast began to fade. Replacing it was something quieter, almost reverent, a belief that the world was wider, richer, and more connected than anyone had dared to dream. When they returned, they brought stories of lands that shimmered with color, of forests so green they seemed to breathe, of people who spoke languages like song, of stars unfamiliar and skies that curved differently over distant waters. Europe listened with a kind of awe. The boundaries of imagination had been redrawn, but exploration was not only of land and sea, it was of thought, of spirit, of the invisible worlds that lived inside the human mind. The great thinkers of the age, nourished by centuries of rediscovered wisdom, began to ask deeper questions. What is truth? What is freedom? What is the soul? It was an age of rediscovery, but also of introspection. People had learned, through loss, to value reflection, to see meaning in the quiet spaces between action and rest. A scholar might sit by a window for hours, watching the light shift across the pages of an old text, pondering what it meant to be human. A painter might study the way sunlight touched a child's face, trying to capture not just the likeness, but the tenderness. A musician might pause between notes, allowing the silence to sing. Every act of creation became a meditation on life itself. The memory of death had taught humanity that beauty was fleeting, and that was what made it sacred. Across Europe, cathedrals glowed with new glass and marble. In Italy, the brush of Raphael and Michelangelo turned stone and pigment into breath. In the north, painters like Bruegel and Dürer looked closer to home, capturing fields, farmers, and humble faces with the same reverence once reserved for saints. The divine, they seemed to say, could be found in the everyday. Even the way people saw time began to shift. Before the plague, life had felt like an endless repetition, the same fields, the same seasons, the same prayers. But now, time felt precious. Each day was a gift, each hour a thread in a tapestry that might end at any moment. Clocks appeared not just in churches, but in homes and squares, marking the hours with soft chimes, a reminder that time, though measured, was not to be wasted. In this awareness of mortality, people found a strange kind of peace. They no longer sought to escape death, they sought to understand it. The afterlife was not seen only as judgment, but as continuation. The world beyond became a place of calm rather than fear, a horizon, like the sea, waiting with open arms. And so, faith itself began to change. It softened, it became less about punishment and more about presence. The sermons of the age spoke not of wrath but of grace, not of separation but of connection. God was not a distant ruler to be appeased, but a light woven into all things, the same light that flickered in the stars, the same that shone in the eyes of a child. In quiet monasteries, monks studied the heavens and the earth alike, believing that both were written in the same divine language. They drew charts of the stars and diagrams of plants, searching for harmony between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between heaven and man. The more they learned, the more they felt wonder, not pride. Knowledge was not conquest, it was worship. Even the great cities, bustling and alive, held spaces of stillness. A scholar walking through Florence at dusk might pause in a courtyard filled with the scent of orange blossoms and hear the distant song of a lute. A craftsman, resting his tools for the day, might watch the sky turn from gold to violet and feel, for a moment, that he was part of something vast and timeless. This was the quiet heart of the age, the sense that life, fragile and impermanent as it was, carried a meaning that could not be destroyed. The plague had shown how easily everything could be lost. The centuries that followed became a meditation on how deeply everything could be loved. Even wars and struggles, when they came, were tempered by memory. Rulers and rebels alike carried with them an awareness that power, too, was mortal. That glory faded. That peace was the only legacy worth leaving. The monuments they built were no longer merely to themselves, but to the endurance of the human spirit. Libraries expanded. Music grew more intricate, more emotional. Architecture reached for balance. Domes that mirrored the heavens, bridges that united divided cities, and beneath it all ran that quiet undercurrent of renewal, the same one that had begun when the first green shoots rose from the ground after the plague. In every village, in every city, the children who were born knew nothing of the Black Death, but they lived in a world shaped by it. The abundance of land, the rise of trade, the spread of art and learning, all were born from the reshaping of the old order. The silence that had once hung over Europe had become a hum, the hum of life continuing. And in that hum, there was music, not grand or triumphant, but gentle, like the sound of waves on a distant shore, or wind moving through tall grass. It was the sound of humanity breathing again. Each generation added its verse, small, humble, sincere. The farmers, the sailors, the painters, the dreamers, they had learned that the story of the world was not one of conquest, but of endurance. That from loss could come understanding, that from darkness could come a deeper kind of light. And so, the centuries after the Black Death became not merely a recovery, but a quiet revolution not shouted in the streets, but whispered in the hearts of those who dared to believe in life again. The old scars remained, but they had become lines of strength, reminders of where the world had been broken, and how it had healed. The plague had ended. But the story it began, the story of resilience, compassion, and rediscovery, would continue to shape humanity forever. The centuries drifted onward, soft as mist on an early morning sea. The plague that had once silenced continents now belonged to the distant past. Its name murmured only in old chronicles and fading parish records. Yet, like the faint echo of a bell heard across the valley, its influence still lingered. It lived in the way people built their cities, in the way they thought about health and time, and the fragile gift of being alive. By the 17th century, the world had grown restless and bright. The quiet reflection that followed the Black Death had given birth to energy, slow at first, then unstoppable. Ships roamed oceans, carrying not just goods but the pulse of curiosity. Great libraries filled with the knowledge that earlier generations had saved from oblivion. Everywhere, there was motion, a stirring of thought, invention, and exploration. But still, in the quiet corners of life, there remained that undertone of humility. People had learned, over and over, that life could change with a breath. They built not just for themselves, but for what might come after. Churches stood taller now, but so did hospitals, schools, and bridges. The structures of stone and timber carried within them the soft memory of human vulnerability. In the countryside, villages stretched further into the fields. Windmills turned lazily under wide skies. Rivers glittered with the reflections of new towns. And everywhere, there was the sound of work, not desperate, but steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. The old medieval fear of unseen forces began to fade. The sickness that had once been called divine punishment was now studied as nature, as process, as something that could be understood. The first physicians began to write of circulation, of the invisible systems within the body that mirrored the movements of the stars. There was a kind of poetry in it, the belief that everything, from the smallest vein to the grandest constellation, was connected. This sense of connection became the quiet philosophy of the age. People no longer saw themselves as small figures in a universe of wrath, but as part of an immense, intricate harmony. The heavens were not so far away now. They were reflected in every drop of dew, every spark of candlelight, every turning wheel of a mill. In cities, this harmony was reflected in art and architecture. Streets were laid out with symmetry, squares surrounded by graceful columns and arches. Gardens were designed to mirror the order of creation, fountains at the center, paths radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, symbolizing the balance of heaven and earth. Even in music, that search for order could be heard. The compositions of the new century moved like the seasons, calm, circular, complete. The human voice had become one instrument among many, blending into an architecture of sound that rose and fell like the tide. But beneath this order, the world still carried traces of the chaos that had once consumed it. Disease had not vanished, nor had hunger or war. Yet each time hardship returned, humanity met it differently, with more patience, more understanding, more grace. The memory of how bad it had once been seemed to give strength to endure whatever came. In London, in the mid-1600s, another great plague swept through, smaller than the Black Death, but fierce. And yet, in the way people recorded it, in the way they responded, you could see how much had changed. The physicians wrote, the caretakers stayed, the chroniclers observed. There was fear, yes, but there was also a kind of acceptance. The panic of the old world had been replaced by reflection. Those who survived wrote, not of punishment, but of perseverance. They spoke of how the city would rise again, how life would return, and it did again and again. This resilience became one of the defining traits of humankind. The more the world had been broken, the more it seemed to understand how to mend itself. By the time the Enlightenment began to dawn, the world had learned to think in light. Candles became lamps, lamps became lenses. Knowledge spread faster, sharper, clearer. The plague, which had once been seen as mystery and terror, was now studied under glass. Microscopes revealed the unseen worlds within a drop of water, tiny, intricate, alive. People realized that nature was not against them, but part of them, that the same patterns that governed the heavens governed the heartbeat, the seasons, and the growth of a flower. To understand these patterns was not to defy the divine, but to draw closer to it. And yet, through all this progress, the soul of the world remained gentle. There were still nights when the air was filled with the smell of wood smoke, when families gathered near the fire and told stories that stretched back generations. The story of the Black Death still appeared sometimes, not as horror, but as history. A parable of endurance whispered to remind children that even the darkest night passes. The Enlightenment's thinkers, those who filled notebooks with sketches of stars and cells, often spoke of reason, but what they sought most deeply was harmony. The plague had shown the fragility of order. Now, they wanted to understand how to preserve it. Their discoveries were acts of care, not just for themselves, but for all who would come after. And so, hospitals became cleaner, waterways were mapped and purified, cities were planned with air and sunlight in mind. It was as though the whole world had decided to keep the memory of suffering as a guide, to ensure it would never be repeated if it could be helped. Through the 1700s, Europe grew into the rhythm of modern life. The plague that had once defined its destiny had become a distant myth, its lessons absorbed into the way people thought, built, and dreamed. But though the fear had faded, the awareness remained, a quiet reverence for the delicate balance between life and loss. Even the arts reflected it. Poets spoke of transience, of the fleeting beauty of the seasons. Painters captured not just grand scenes but small, tender ones, a hand resting on a book, a candle nearly burned down, a garden touched by twilight. These images spoke softly of impermanence, of gratitude. Everywhere, the human story was learning to breathe more deeply. Each century, each invention, each discovery was an affirmation of the same truth, that life endures, that it rebuilds, that it remembers. And so, though the Black Death was long gone, it was never truly forgotten. It lived in the spaces between knowledge and faith, in the empathy that people carried for one another. It had transformed fear into understanding, despair into curiosity, isolation into connection. The people of the 18th century may not have known it consciously, but the world they lived in, its order, its cleanliness, its rhythm was built on the lessons of that ancient silence. The night sky, still the same as it had been in the 1300s, now looked down upon a world forever changed. Where once villages had burned and bells had tolled endlessly, there were now cities of light, gardens of symmetry, and ships crossing oceans without fear. Humanity had not conquered nature, it had learned, slowly and humbly, to live alongside it, and in that harmony there was peace, a quiet, hard-earned peace that would guide generations to come. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world had transformed almost beyond recognition. The great shadows of the Middle Ages were now faint memories, recorded in books whose pages smelled of dust and candle wax. But somewhere beneath the layers of progress, the memory of the Black Death still pulsed, not as a wound anymore, but as a heartbeat, a quiet reminder of how fragile and precious the rhythm of life could be. Cities had grown vast and alive. London, Paris, Florence, Venice, all once struck by plague, now glittered with lamps that burned through the night. Horse carts rattled down cobbled streets, and the air was filled with the hum of markets, laughter, conversation. People no longer hid from one another in fear. They gathered, celebrated, and built with purpose. Hospitals had become centers of learning. Doctors, no longer working in isolation or superstition, shared knowledge through journals and conferences. The study of contagion, of how diseases spread, was becoming science. Glass beakers replaced charms, microscopes replaced prayer beads. The invisible world, once seen only as mystery, was being revealed. And yet, there was a gentleness to this pursuit. The scientists of the New World were not cold. Many of them spoke of awe, of wonder. When they peered into droplets of water and saw the tiny living worlds within, they did not feel superiority. They felt humility. Humanity was finally beginning to understand its place in the vast, interconnected web of life. In small towns, old beliefs still lingered. People still hung herbs above their doors or burned incense to keep the air pure. But now, these customs existed alongside new knowledge, merging the ancient and the modern in a quiet coexistence. There was comfort in it, the sense that both wisdoms, the mystical and the scientific, could walk side by side. The Black Death had left behind more than sorrow. It had taught generations the importance of compassion. Across Europe, new laws appeared, laws that protected the poor, that built hospitals, that cared for the orphaned and sick. Cities began to understand that to protect one person was to protect all. Even architecture reflected this change. Streets were widened to allow air to move more freely. Water systems were built to carry waste away. The very bones of the cities, were being reimagined with health in mind, an echo of the fear that had once emptied them. In these new designs, beauty and function met quietly. A fountain was not just decoration, it was clean water for the people. A park was not just leisure, it was air, green and living, poor lungs that had once known the weight of pestilence. The world was learning how to care for itself. As the 1800s turned toward the industrial age, the pace of life quickened again. Smoke rose over cities, factories hummed, and trains began to carve their paths through valleys and hills. It was another transformation, immense, unstoppable, but beneath it, the lessons of the past still whispered. Even as people chased progress, they remembered the cost of neglect. The idea that sickness could spread through unseen hands, through air, through water. It guided them toward better sanitation, cleaner streets, and healthier lives. Every new invention carried within it a small trace of that ancient caution. And still, amidst the clamor of factories and the noise of cities, there were moments of quiet reflection. Writers and poets spoke softly of time, of loss, of the ghosts of old plagues that once walked the earth. Their words were not fearful, but tender. They reminded readers that progress was not just about machines and cities, it was about the heart, about learning how to live with gentleness despite everything the world could bring. In the countryside, life changed more slowly. Fields that had once lain empty after the Black Death were now thick with crops. Families had returned to the rhythms of the earth, planting, harvesting, resting. Seasons passed with calm familiarity. There was a sense of balance again, a steady breath after centuries of upheaval. And in the great museums and libraries, historians gathered to study the records of those dark years. They read the letters of plague doctors, the prayers of monks, the city ordinances written in panic. And as they read, they realized something profound, that through every tragedy, humanity had never truly stopped creating. Even in its darkest hour, it had painted, written, built, and dreamed. This realization gave birth to a new philosophy, one that saw history not as a chain of disasters, but as a garden of endurance. The Black Death was no longer a story of death. It was a story of renewal. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, medicine took its next great leap. Scientists discovered bacteria, the hidden agents of sickness. The mystery that had haunted humankind for centuries was finally named and seen. With that knowledge came vaccines, hygiene, and public health. The ghost of the plague was, at last, dispelled by light. But still, in the deepest part of the human heart, there remained an echo of that ancient humility, the understanding that no matter how far science advanced, the fragility of life was sacred. The memory of those millions lost had given the living a new sense of care, a deeper gratitude for every sunrise. The bells that once tolled endlessly for the dead had been replaced by the hum of cities, the laughter of markets, the sound of life continuing. Humanity had not escaped its past. It had embraced it, transformed it, and learned to live with it peacefully. And so, as the 20th century began to rise like dawn over the horizon, the long shadow of the Black Death finally began to fade into history, not erased, but integrated, like the final note of a song that continues to echo long after the music has ended. The world was alive again, wiser, gentler, and more aware of its own heartbeat. By the time the 20th century unfurled its first breaths, humanity stood on the threshold of a new world. Streets glittered with electric light instead of torch flame. Steamships and trains wove the continents together. The world that had once been fractured by fear now pulsed with connection. But the rhythm beneath it, the pulse of life, fragile and miraculous, still carried the memory of those lost centuries before. In museums, under glass cases, lay the relics of the Black Death. Masks with long beaks once filled with herbs, worn manuscripts bearing trembling handwriting, and rosaries worn smooth by anxious prayer. Visitors would walk by quietly, the air thick with reverence. These were not just artifacts of disease, they were symbols of endurance, of how deeply the human spirit could bend and still not break. Historians would speak softly of the transformation that followed that dark time, the ways in which people rebuilt not only their cities, but their sense of what it meant to live. The Black Death had made humanity conscious of time, of mortality, and of the beauty that flickers between both. In the early morning hours of the modern world, before the noise of cars and factories began, one could imagine the echo of an older silence, the same kind that settled over Europe when the plague had burned itself out. A silence heavy with realization, a quiet where the world, once emptied, had learned again how to breathe. For though centuries had passed, people still carried faint memories in their collective soul. When they washed their hands, when they built hospitals, when they planted trees where cemeteries once lay, they were, without knowing it, speaking to the past. Somewhere in England, a small village that had once been struck by the plague now stood peaceful and bright. The cottages were painted white, their gardens full of flowers. Children played where the fields had once been deserted, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, the villagers would find small fossils and old coins in the soil, remnants of another time, reminders that life and loss had walked here hand in hand. In Italy, where bells once tolled endlessly, church towers now rang in joy. In France, where processions of mourners once filled the streets, festivals of music and laughter had returned. In the countryside of Germany, wildflowers had reclaimed the ground that had once been graves. The land had healed itself slowly, patiently, with the same grace that time always brings. The Black Death had begun as a story of suffering, but in its aftermath lay the story of everything that followed: the Renaissance, humanism, medicine, the idea that knowledge could save. It was not the plague that shaped the modern world, but the courage that came after. And in that realization, there was peace, because humanity had learned that every ending holds a seed of renewal, that even in the stillest winter, something unseen is preparing to bloom. As centuries went on, art, literature, and music all carried faint traces of those lessons. Painters filled their canvases with life and light. Poets wrote about rebirth, about time, about love surviving loss. Composers captured in their melodies the same quiet ache, that mixture of sadness and gratitude that lingers after long darkness. The Black Death, once a shadow, had become a muse. It reminded people that life was never guaranteed, and therefore always sacred. That laughter, friendship, and even small daily moments, a candle flickering at dusk, the warmth of bread, the whisper of wind through an open window, were the treasures that made existence meaningful. Even in the most advanced age, with skyscrapers and machines, the world still carried that old, quiet understanding that life is both fragile and magnificent. And if you were to wander one evening through an old European town, one with narrow streets and stone houses, you might still feel it. That stillness that comes just before nightfall, the echo of footsteps, the faint scent of rain on ancient cobblestones. It's as if the centuries themselves are breathing beside you, whispering softly that everything you see was once nearly lost, and yet, somehow, endured. The past is never gone. It simply becomes quieter, turning into the soil beneath our feet, the air we breathe, the stories we tell to remind ourselves how far we've come. The world after the Black Death became a world aware of its own heartbeat, slower, softer, and infinitely more grateful. And even now, when the stars appear over calm cities, when the wind rustles through old churchyards, there is a kind of peace that feels timeless, as if the earth itself remembers the long journey from darkness to light. It is a peace earned through survival, a quiet that says, we are still here, and in that stillness, humanity rests not fearful anymore, but deeply, profoundly awake to the miracle of life. The bells that once tolled in mourning now ring in serenity. The world has turned, the seasons have healed, and the silence that follows is not emptiness, but grace.